Recording in progress.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Ritter, and I'm the rector here at Trinity Church, and so let me first extend a gracious welcome to all of you, especially our visitors, for being with us here today. As you see in your programs, we have a two-part program. First, we are going to hear from Dr. Dennis Michell about what Natchez was like when this church building was built 200 years ago. So what life was like in Natchez at that time. And then also we will debut today our bicentennial documentary film, which tells you about, it's about 18 minutes long, it tells you about the history, the 200-year history of Trinity Church. So you'll learn more about this building and about Trinity Church's place in Natchez over the last 200 years. Let us begin with our Bicentennial Prayer. All loving and gracious God, we thank you for the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ. For 200 years, Trinity Church has journeyed in faith and worship. We have tried to live the gospel message in service to one another and this community of Natchez. As we celebrate the joyous event of our bicentennial as a church, continue to walk with us as we seek to be receptive to your grace. Send us your Spirit to enlighten our minds, strengthen our wills, and open our hearts. By our continued witness, may others know you. Amen. Again, welcome, and I want to officially welcome you to the first in our Marion Smith Speaker Series. The Speaker Series is named after Marion Smith, one of our very, very long-time parishioners, very active here in Natchez, but also especially here at Trinity Church, and so we are grateful to offer this opportunity to all of you as we begin the celebration of our bicentennial year in this coming year. Special acknowledgements. I want to thank Marion's children, the Smith children, Will Smith Jr., Emily Smith Wright, and her family, for underwriting this event in honor of their father, Marion Smith. And they are with us today. Thank you. I also commend to you the many acknowledgements that are in your program. There are so many people to thank for today and for the products of today, and we are grateful to them all. I'd like to introduce to you then first our speaker, Dr. Dennis J. Michell. His longer bio is in your program. And because of COVID restrictions for Dr. Michell, it will have to be delivered today during Zoom, via Zoom, and so we apologize for that, but at least he is with us live. Dr. Dennis J. Michell is Professor Emeritus at Mississippi State University, where he taught and administered the Division of Arts and Sciences for 20 years until he retired in 2016. He edits the Journal of Mississippi History and is author of several books, including his latest, A New History of Mississippi, published in 2014 by University Press of Mississippi. So we welcome Dr. Dennis J. Michell amongst us today. He is currently in New Mexico, I think, and again, because of COVID, could not be here with us physically, but is with us live on Zoom. So please welcome Dr. Dennis J. Michell.
Okay, I'm on?
Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I appreciate this opportunity to learn a great deal more about Natchez than I did previously. What I have learned is that Antebellum, Natchez is a unique city. It unlike probably any other place on the American frontier. First of all, the Native Americans, the Natchez, were the last of the sun-worshiping, mound-building Native Americans. All of the Native Americans in the Southeast had been this sort of culture until the 1500s, when the Spaniards spread the old world diseases among them, and there was a Holocaust. And the cultures that grew out of that were the nations such as the Chickasaw and the Choctaw. So that was a unique aspect of Natchez culture. With the coming of the Europeans, Natchez developed into an isolated outpost of the frontier. It was separated from the American frontier by the hundreds of miles of the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. And it was hundreds of miles from New Orleans, and it was difficult to come back up the river in the beginning. But at the same time, Natchez was more connected to Europe and the eastern seaboard than the rest of the American frontier. I mean, the elite of Natchez bought their wines and their furniture and their clothing from Europe. Third, 40% of the slaves in Natchez had come directly from Africa. The remainder of the American frontier was populated by slaves born in America, but not in Natchez. Fourth, the Spaniards, when they acquired Natchez, established it as a buffer colony between the rest of their huge empire in the Americas, and first the British colonies, and then the American nation. And we'll get into that a little more in a minute. The settlers in Natchez more often came from Europe and from the eastern seaboard, many of them from Pennsylvania. Most of the other frontier was populated from the Carolinas and Georgia and so forth. So they had a different outlook because of their background. Fifth, the planters were able to eliminate the small white farmers from the frontier. And those small white farmers made up the majority of the population in the rest of the frontier. They basically were in a subsistence sort of economy, much like the Native Americans had been. They lived on corn and pigs, and they had what was called a frontier exchange economy without money involved. And then Natchez did not participate in what's known as the evangelical religions. Those small white farmers in most of the frontier had a religion that was born in the camp meetings with African Americans and white Americans participating together. Their religion involved speaking in tongues, out-of-body experiences. What Natchez chose was a more established type of religion, and that made a huge difference. Well, the chronological history, of course, begins with the arrival of the French into the Natchez settlement. The Natchez had a history of accepting refugees from Native American groups who came through their territory. And they continued that kind of habit with the French. But as the French began to take the best of their farmland and to introduce European trade goods that altered the Natchez culture, the Natchez had had enough. And what they decided to do was adopt what we would call today a policy of ethnic cleansing. They staged a well-timed surprise uprising against the French and were able to kill and capture most of them. But the French in New Orleans, of course, counterattacked, and they allied themselves with the Choctaw, who were the most powerful military force in the area. And they defeated the Natchez fairly easily. The Natchez tried to escape, but they pursued them. They persuaded them to surrender. And then they sold the Natchez into slavery through New Orleans to their colonies in the Caribbean. The result was that Natchez was pretty well deserted. Not many French came back. The Natchez were gone, except for a few who found refuge with the Chickasaw and continued to fight the French for years. So with this desertion of the Natchez area, the Choctaw wandered through, but never settled. In one of the endless European colonial wars, Great Britain acquired Natchez and then pretty well ignored it. Their headquarters for their colony of British West Florida was in Pensacola, far away from Natchez. They gave some land grants to some of their ex-soldiers, but they made no real investment. The Spanish in the next colonial war were able to conquer Pensacola, and when they did, they acquired Natchez. And it's the Spanish who make the first big investment of any of the European powers in Natchez. The system at the time was one of mercantilism, which held that the wealth of the world was determined by the amount of silver and gold that you could acquire. And so all of the colonial powers attempted to produce a cash crop in their colonies could be sold on the world market that would bring gold and silver to the mother country. And so that's what the Spaniards intended to do. They also, of course, wanted to do this to create this buffer colony to protect their empire. The crop that they settled on was tobacco. The tobacco that you could produce in Natchez was not of the quality that Virginia, say, could produce. But so it really couldn't compete in the marketplace, except that the British provided a subsidy to the settlers in Natchez to grow tobacco. And because of the subsidy, they succeeded in producing tobacco, which was exported to the other Spanish colonies. The Spaniards were willing to invest all this money because they wanted a buffer to protect their huge American empire from the growing British and then American empire. In order to attract more settlers and more planters, they tolerated Protestant religions and encouraged Americans and British people to settle in Natchez. They did hire Irish priests, English-speaking priests, hoping that they could convert the settlers, but that plan didn't work. But otherwise, their plan did work. They had an outstanding governor named Gayoso, I'm sure you're familiar with. He was educated in England, spoke fluent English. His wife died while he was governor of Natchez, and he intermarried into the English-speaking elite. And it was he who set the tone for Natchez. He built the first mansion that other planters copied. He had a fine wine cellar and was very hospitable. He is the model that the planters followed as Natchez developed. Well, the subsidy that the Spaniards were providing to make Natchez prosperous became so onerous that the Spaniards withdrew the subsidy. And this panicked the planters. Of course, they tried some other crops such as indigo, which were a failure. But then the Spaniards imported a strain of cotton from Mexico that grew marvelously. And of course, it was cotton that made Natchez rich. The Spaniards were loath to part with Natchez, but in the treaties that ended the American Revolution, the border was disputed, and the United States claimed Natchez as their own under the treaties. They negotiated with the Spaniards and eventually acquired Natchez by treaty. The population of Natchez was skeptical because all 4 European nations had made land grants, and those land grants didn't recognize one another. They overlapped. And so people were nervous about which land grants the Americans would recognize. And also, the state of Georgia, under its charter, original charter, was claiming ownership of Natchez. It took a lot of lawyers a long time to get the land titles straight. But there was another reason. During the American Revolution, a man named Willing, who had lived in Natchez for a number of years, returned to his native Pennsylvania and acquired a commission as a captain in the American Navy. He came back to Natchez with some border ruffians and looted Natchez. And so the settlers were skeptical of American ownership at first. The development of the plantations squeezed out, eliminated the small white farmers that we've talked about already. Those farmers had a very different culture from that was developing in Natchez. With slavery, for example, the small white farmers, if they owned slaves, had a very personal relationship. There's a good story that I included in my book about a planter's son who had worked for his father for 20 years and decided he wanted his own farm. And he gradually persuaded his father to help him acquire the land, but then he didn't have labor except his own. So he had a neighbor who had a runaway slave, and he went to the neighbor and purchased the runaway slave, and then he put out the word through the slave grapevine that what he had done, and asked the slave to come in to work for him. And the slave did. They worked in the fields together. They lived in one house together. They ate their meals together. It was a very personal kind of relationship, unlike what was developing on the plantations. The other aspect of the small farmer culture was, as I mentioned before, religion. When the camp meeting was superseded by churches, the churches that the small white farmers adopted were puritanical. They didn't allow dancing. They didn't allow drinking. Women could not wear fancy clothes or jewelry. Of course, the planters did all of those things with great gusto. So Natchez excluded the evangelical religion, and I have a couple of observations about the churches in Natchez that I'll quote for you. A traveler named Christian Schultz said of Natchez, "All make love, most of them play, and a few make money. With religion, they have nothing to do." Lorenzo Dow, a Methodist minister who rode a circuit near the city of Natchez, reported that people in Natchez were very rich, very proud, very polite, but had little humility, little religion, and little piety. Dow doubted whether there were 3 Christians in town, either black or white. He may have been a little prejudiced. He also complained that the Natchez Methodist Church didn't contribute 1 cent to his annual salary of $74. At this point, I'd like to do something that I always do in studying history, and that's to introduce biography, to try to give a flavor of life in Natchez. The first biography is of a slave, a man named Ibrahima. Ibrahima was a prince in Africa. His father was a king, and he commanded his father's armies until he was captured in battle and sold into slavery. He ended up in Natchez, owned by a man named Thomas Foster. Foster ignored Ibrahima's pleas to be able to buy his way out of slavery. He took him to the early plantation that was just in the formative stages, and he cut Ibrahima's hair, threw him into a barn, and locked him up. When he turned him out to work in the fields, Ibrahima, of course, ran away. He decided after some time in the woods that he would never find his way back to Africa. And so he went back to the plantation, and he found Mrs. Foster at home. He lay on the floor before her, took her foot and placed it on his neck, indicating he accepted his fate as a slave. He was a Muslim. He never drank. He worked hard, and he became indispensable to Foster. Foster trusted him so much that he allowed him to go to trade in the market in Natchez. It was there in the market that Ibrahima was recognized by an Irish doctor who was passing through Natchez. He knew Ibrahima because Ibrahima had rescued him when he was shipwrecked in Africa. The doctor tried to buy Ibrahima from Foster, but Ibrahima was so valuable that Foster refused to sell. So he continued on the plantation. He married a fellow slave and had an American family. But something happened. Ibrahima's biography believes that Ibrahima's daughter had an affair with Foster's son, and this created a break between the two men. And there was a newspaper editor in Natchez who had been trying to persuade Ibrahima to write his story. He was literate in Arabic. And Ibrahima had always refused until this disruption took place. He wrote it in Arabic. It was translated into English and widely publicized. And Foster finally relented and gave Ibrahima his freedom if he returned to Africa and if he left his American family behind in slavery, which he did. He made it back to Africa, but never back to his homeland. He died before he reached it. That's probably the most famous slave in Natchez history. The next biography is that of Stephen Duncan. Duncan was a native of Pennsylvania who studied medicine there and became a doctor. He had relatives in the elite in Natchez, and so he came to Natchez to practice medicine. Very quickly, he accumulated enough money to buy land and slaves. He also inherited the position of president of the bank when his relative died. He invested in steamboats and timber mills and land in Louisiana, and he was the second largest slaveholder in America. He was a forward-looking, thinking man, and he did not believe that slavery would endure forever. So he thought it was necessary to plan for the end of it. He also did not believe that white Americans and black Americans could live together when slavery ended. And so he helped to establish the American Colonization Society and was president of the Mississippi Colonization Society. And the policy of the society was to repatriate black people to Africa. And they did. There is today a place in Liberia known as Mississippi in Africa. But they didn't, they weren't able to repatriate that many. Duncan was also the founder of your church. He, according to his biographer, was not a religious man in the sense of the evangelicals, but he believed in the necessity and importance of an established church. He was treasurer of the church and had a great deal to do with the building of the church. He refused to serve on the vestry, but he had played a major role in the creation of your church. By the 1830s, Natchez had matured. The churches were built, the mansions were built, cotton had made Natchez extremely wealthy. The steamboat meant now the communication with New Orleans and the world was easy. But the planters did suffer a downturn in the 1830s when the price of cotton plummeted. But they carried out what some historians have called an agricultural revolution. They began to grow sweet potatoes and hogs on the plantations. Where they had imported food for their slaves, they now fed their slaves. They became more self-sufficient and even more wealthy and more successful. But you know, I should point out that even though they were so wealthy and so successful, they never controlled the city government of Natchez. The government of the city was under control of the merchants, professional class people, middle class people. And those people enjoyed sometimes tweaking the beards of the elite. But the elite did control for a number of years the state government of Mississippi through an organization known as the Junto. But with the removal of the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and the flood of immigrants who came into Mississippi, they lost control of the state. But that did not mean that they weren't still expansive and ambitious. They looked outside of Mississippi to Texas. The elite sent military aid to Texas. They purchased thousands of acres of land in Texas and saw it as an area for their continued prosperity. They even looked outside of the continent, North American continent. They looked to Cuba, which they hoped to wrest away from the Spaniards and turn into an American slave state. The leader of this group in Natchez, of course, was John A. Quitman, who was elected governor but had to resign because of his involvement in a plan to invade Cuba. The big point is that the elite planters of Natchez were nationalists. They were not headed toward secession or a separate southern nation. They continued to send their sons to school at Harvard and Yale. They maintained their ties with the New York banks. They sometimes spent every summer in the north to avoid the Mississippi heat of the summertime. So they, despite losing control of the state government in Mississippi, were still expansive and ambitious. The society that the elite created in Natchez was unusual, unique in their relationship with the slave population and the free black population. When the middle class city government feared a slave uprising, they instituted what was known as the Inquisition to question slaves and try to force confessions from them. The elite supported their slaves and even supported the free black population. Of course, the most famous free black man in Natchez was William Johnson, the barber of Natchez, he was called. His father had freed Johnson and Johnson's mother, and he continued to support the mother who owned the business. He even supported her in court when necessary. Johnson was able to become a very wealthy man. His home is still there today. Was a substantial home. He made enough money to buy land and slaves. He loaned money to both white and black people in Natchez. But he was murdered by a man who was probably a mulatto, but claimed white status. And the elite, no one ever punished the man for the murder. As I said, the relationship, interracial relationships, and the society in Natchez was complex beyond belief. When secession came in 1860, 73% of the voters in Natchez voted against it. It wasn't just the elite. All of Natchez was absorbed in this culture. When the Union Navy shows up on the river before Natchez, Natchez surrendered readily because Natchez had never supported the war. It's ironic that it was only when the pilgrimage began in the Great Depression that people in Mississippi and in America came to believe that the inhabitants of Natchez were the epitome of southernness. They just never were. It was a lot more complicated than that. Thank you very much.
I know some of that was hard to hear. We're very limited on Zoom in terms of audio, but If you have any questions, I'm happy to convey those to Dr. Michell, and he'll do his best to answer them. What I'll also do, if you did have to miss parts of that because of the audio, I do have the entire lecture by Dr. Michell in writing, actually. And I will make that available on our church website, which is trinitynatchez.org. The website happens to be down today. I'm working with our host to get it back up, but I will post that on there, and you can go and glance that on your own at some point. So are there any questions at all? Okay. Dr. Michell, I think that's it. There are no questions.
Well, it's my first Zoom lecture. I think it's probably a little more difficult with Zoom than it is in person.
Thank you, Dr. Michell, very much.
You're very welcome. Okay, bye. It's over.
Next, I'd like to present to you Trinity's documentary film called Faith in Action since 1822, and it covers most of the history of our church. I want to acknowledge a few people before we begin who had a lot to do with the making of this film. First, I'd like to acknowledge Mark Lafrances. Mark, where are you, Mark? Would you stand up, please? Mark was our, Mark shot and edited the film for us and did a great job, as you'll see. I also want to thank Carolyn Vance Smith. Carolyn wrote the script and did a lot to produce that film. I want to thank John Norris. John is not able to be with us here today, but John was the narrator for the film. And I want to thank Ben Hillier, who much of his photography and so forth is in the film, and we want to thank him very much for his contributions as well. So without further ado, I present to you Faith in Action since 1822.
Welcome to Trinity Church's Bicentennial Film. For 200 years, the people of Trinity Episcopal Church, Natchez, Mississippi, have worshiped and ministered in abiding faith in Jesus Christ. We have also been inspired by our beautiful church building, which is the oldest in the Diocese of Mississippi. Come journey with us for 200 years. Enjoy the film.
In the early 1820s, Anglican settlers in the Natchez area were eager to have an Episcopal minister and a church building in which to worship. An article in the Natchez Democrat on February 17, 1884, states that a group of men were dining in 1821 at the home of Stephen Duncan when a discussion arose about an upcoming marriage. The men asked one another, "Why can't we have an Episcopal minister? Why can't we have a church?" Their wishes were soon fulfilled, for at their invitation on March 9, 1822, the Reverend James Pillmore of Maryland, an Oxford University graduate, arrived in Natchez. He became the first rector of Trinity Church on April 9, 1822. He held services elsewhere in Natchez while the present church building was being built. The first worship service was held there in May 1823. The church, which appears in an 1823 oil painting by the naturalist John James Audubon, is a rectangular building by John Muntz and George Williams. It originally had an immense dome top. In the late 1830s, a remodeling by George Reynolds and Mark Breeden resulted in the removal of the dome and the addition of a new roof and a spectacular Greek Revival facade. Much of the remainder of the church retains its original design. Alterations include a raised chancel with recess altar, added in 1883, and stained glass windows installed between 1884 and 1963. The church was the site of the organizational meeting of the Episcopal Diocese of Mississippi on June 1826. Trinity was one of 4 original parishes in the diocese, with the others being Christ Church, Church Hill, founded in 1820, St. Paul's Church, Woodville, 1823, and St. John's Church, now St. James, Port Gibson, 1826. Since 1827, Trinity has hosted dozens of other diocesan conventions, now called councils, including the very important convention in May 1849. At that convention, the Reverend William Mercer Green of North Carolina was elected the first bishop of the Diocese of Mississippi. He arrived in Natchez in January 1850 and assumed the duties of rector of the Trinity Church. He was consecrated bishop in St. Andrew's Church, Jackson. That year, there were 18 churches in the diocese, with a total of 506 members, 117 of whom were members of Trinity Church. For all of 1850 and most of 1851, Bishop Green lived in Natchez and was both bishop and rector. In September 1851, the bishop, his family, and his office moved to Jackson, Mississippi. A true missionary, Bishop Green helped the diocese grow so that by 1860 there were 44 churches with 1,356 communicants, of which 162 were blacks. During the Civil War, Trinity Church suffered greatly, along with the rest of the country. Members went to war and many lost their lives, while those at home were also deeply affected. The church endured major financial troubles and also had important members strongly disagreeing about the war. For instance, Trinity member Vorina Howell, who married Jefferson Davis in 1845, became the First Lady of the Confederate States of America. Stephen Duncan, who helped found Trinity Church and in 1860 was one of the wealthiest men in America, opposed secession from the Union. In 1863, Duncan moved from Natchez to New York City, never to return. After the Civil War, in April 1866, the Reverend Charles B. Dana became rector. He found the financial condition of the parish greatly depressed. However, by the time of his death in 1873, the church was beginning to rebound. That year, the Reverend Alexander Marks of New Orleans was elected to lead Trinity Church. According to Charles Steaton Roth's 100 Years with Old Trinity Church, published in 1922, Mr. Marks, in a very short time, had the whole congregation busily at work. 3 major physical accomplishments were inspired by Mr. Marks. First, the interior of the church was transformed, Mr. Steaton Roth wrote. Second was the addition in 1883 of a raised chancel, a recess altar, and the Ascension stained glass window, all consecrated at a major church event on February 17, 1884, by the Right Reverend Hugh Miller Thompson. And the third was the addition of a 2-story brick education building in 1887 to 1888. On February 20th, 1884, the Trinity Vestry formally thanked Stephen Duncan Jr. for funding the Ascension window. And on April 29, 1888, the vestry delivered to Mr. Duncan a letter of thanks for his magnificent gifts to the church in the parish building and the chancel. The letter stated, "This has been adopted since his gifts had become known, and he could not remain incognito any longer." In 1883, the Reverend Hugh Miller Thompson was consecrated bishop and elected assistant bishop of Mississippi. His mission was especially to assist Bishop Green, who was serving both as Bishop of Mississippi and Chancellor of the University of the South, Sewanee, Tennessee. One of Bishop Thompson's priority was care for the spiritual welfare of black people and the building up of a black priesthood and laity, according to an 1883 resolution drawn at a council of clergy and lay delegates. More than half of living Mississippians are black people, Bishop Thompson said at the 1884 council. There is no color line in the church, he said. As a result of the bishop's leadership, new churches for blacks in the diocese were organized. One was Trinity Chapel, established with the help of Trinity Church. According to the Episcopal Church in Mississippi, the chapel opened in 1889 with a black priest. In 1895, the Reverend George Gilbert Middleton reported 52 communicants. Through ensuing years, the chapel had fluctuations in membership and was finally closed in 1925, after which time some members worshiped at Trinity Church. Between 1895 and 1963, 10 additional ecclesiastical stained glass windows were placed in the nave, given to the glory of God and in memory or in thanksgiving of loved ones. All 11 ecclesiastical windows welcome viewers into a worship space like no other in the state of Mississippi, said Kathleen Bond, author of Trinity's Stained Glass Windows in Welcome to the Trinity Table, celebrating 200 years. Their size, brilliant colors, and exquisite craftsmanship command attention and impart a spiritual experience of awe, she said. God's light shines through, animating their eternal messages. Repairs for the parish building in 1907 include funds for a covered and closed passageway from that structure to the church. While the Reverend Joseph Keenley was rector from 1914 to 1946, major calamity ensued not once but twice in the form of 2 horrific world wars. More than 60 men from Trinity fought in World War I. During World War II, more than 100 of Trinity's male and female parishioners served valiantly. In both wars, many gave their lives. Between the world wars, at the annual convention in 1929, Mr. Keenley encouraged all strong churches in the diocese to help churches in need. Soon thereafter, Trinity Church, a strong parish, and Christ Church, by then a small congregation, began a long-term relationship. In 2018, the two were named partners in mission by the Right Reverend Brian Sage, with the Reverend Ken Ritter serving as rector of Trinity Church and vicar of Christ Church. Trinity Church felt the negative effects of the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933, with deep budget cuts. However, by 1934, the parish's budget was balanced and necessary funds available to renovate the church interior. Following World War II, the Reverend Louis Ovander Thomas became rector, serving from 1946 to 1975. In 1951, the church had 515 members, with 151 in church school. A strong believer in education, Mr. Thomas led a movement to establish Trinity Episcopal School. It began in 1950 with preschoolers, and soon thereafter added higher-level classes. In 1971, the school's first graduation ceremony for 12th graders took place. The school, fully accredited and racially integrated, thrived for decades, winning top academic and athletic awards. Declining area population and economic conditions caused low enrollment and closure in 2018. In 1976, while the Reverend Martin Luther Agnew Jr. was rector, the sesquicentennial of the Diocese of Mississippi and the bicentennial year of the nation were jointly celebrated at Trinity Church at the 149th Annual Council. That year, to honor the two longest-serving rectors of Trinity Church, the Education Building Parish Hall was named Keenly Hall, and the house at 506 Washington Street, bought by the church in 1965, was named Thomas Hall. In 1982, under the leadership of the Reverend Lemuel G. Parks, Jr., Trinity joined 3 other Natchez churches to establish the Stew Pot, an interfaith endeavor that annually supplies 10,000 free meals per month for the needy. Members of Trinity regularly cook, serve, and deliver hot meals. In 1988 and 1989, Mr. Parks oversaw the expansion and renovation of Keenly Hall, and also strongly supported the Episcopal Young Churchmen, now Episcopal Youth Community, a group of 40 teenagers. In 2000, Trinity Church helped establish the Natchez Habitat for Humanity, a nonprofit housing organization, with Trinity members Stanford Buddy Rain Jr. as board member. By 2019, more than 20 needy families had new housing. Under the leadership of the Reverend Zabron Chip Davis, rector from 1997 until 2009, refurbishing work was accomplished at Christ Episcopal Church in 1998 and 2001, at Thomas Hall in 1999, and at Keenly Hall in 2004. In 2003, Trinity's stained glass windows received ultraviolet protection and the Lafarge window was repaired. The Reverend Walton Jones, rector from 2011 until 2016, led a major capital funds drive to finance the repair and renovation of the church and Keenly Hall. He helped reestablish Daughters of the King, a national church women's group devoted to prayer, service, and evangelism. In 2015, Father Walton created the first Clause for a Cause, an event that generated the first year more than $20,000, an amount shared with the Episcopal Camp, Bratton Green, and the Pleasant Acre Day School. This street party is now an annual benefit event that helps large numbers of those in need. Soon after arriving in 2017, the Reverend Ken Ritter helped the church establish the Fred L. Callan Memorial Garden between the church and Keenly Hall. The garden honors a devoted member and treasurer of the church. In 2019, the vestry, in consultation with the rector, finalized the sale of Trinity School to Cornerstone Church. On February 22, 2020, Bishop Sage and Father Ken led the bicentennial celebration of Christ Church, Church Hill, which attracted a standing room-only crowd of more than 315 people. A national shutdown due to the coronavirus in spring of 2020 resulted in a year with no public worship services. Father Ken, well versed in modern telecommunications, presented services online. Father Ken also spearheaded Trinity's bicentennial celebration with a large committee of volunteers. The celebration began with the launch of a book, Welcome to the Trinity Table, Recollections and Recipes Celebrating 200 Years, 1822 to 2022, in November 2020. Other activities included an oral history project and a short documentary film, both about Trinity, the installation of a Mississippi historical marker in front of the church, indoor and outdoor exhibits, publications, a speaker series, and hosting both diocesan council and a celebratory concert in 2022. Throughout its history, members of the Trinity Church have served the broader church as ordained priests and licensed lay readers, members of the diocesan committees and boards, and diocesan deputies to General Convention. Members have also been public servants and national leaders. In the 19th century, they included Edward Turner, Justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court, Adam L. Bingaman, President of the Senate in Mississippi Legislature and Speaker of the Mississippi House of Representatives, John A. Quitman, Mississippi Governor and United States Congressman, Sergeant Smith Prentice, member of the House of Representatives in the Mississippi Legislature, and United States Congressman. And Ayers P. Merrill, United States Minister, resident to Belgium. In the 20th century, leaders included Catherine Grafton Miller, founder of the Natchez Pilgrimage, Grace M.S. McNeil, National President of the Girl Scouts of the United States of America, Marion Smith, President of the Senate and Mississippi Legislature, and Linda Lee Meade, Miss America 1960. The vision statement for Trinity Church sums up the parish's goal. We are one church in mission, inviting, transforming, and reconciling all people to God and neighbor in Natchez and to the ends of the earth.
Hope you enjoyed that. It was a long time in the making, and we're happy to debut that to you today. This film will also appear on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it in the future if you wish, and show it to other people. We advise you to do that. That completes our program today. Again, thank you all for coming. Now we have some refreshments and tours. If you'd like to stay for that, you can go out through those back doors and go into the building just to the side here, or you can go through this back door right over here. It's the easiest thing. You don't have to leave air conditioning. And we have some ice cream, refreshments for you. And then also we've recently completed an extensive renovation of the first floor of our church house, and included some historical articles for people to visit with in celebration of our bicentennial, and we hope that you will go and take a look at all those things. Again, a lot of people have worked hard to make that very special, and I think you will enjoy it. Thank you for coming again today. On behalf of everyone who was responsible for today, thank you very much.